Yeah, I'm doing my host duties also. Um, and so as I started to say, so bear with me as I work through the technical difficulties of Zoom, because there will be a little bit of lag, and I may try and click something and it may not pop up at the right time, or it may drag a little bit. But let me begin by saying it's with a great deal of trepidation that I undertake to be the presenter tonight. It's with mixed emotions that I am choosing to step aside from being the executive director of the Lynching Sites Project. And please note, I said step aside, not stepping down. For as long as I am able, I am very desirous of being a part of the Lynching Sites Project. It was really not my intent to be the presenter tonight. However, my good friend Tom and president of the board convinced me that I should at least share my thinking and perhaps a few conclusions about this experience of diving into the African American experience and really trying to understand it. In my opinion, it is not possible to seriously engage in the history and remembrance of lynching and recognition of the horror that was visited on Africans and people of color globally. I think just as important, if not more important, is understanding the underpinnings of how that evolved, what happened to make it so acceptable to dehumanize people who are different from each other and for so long. For the purposes of this conversation, I am limiting the focus primarily to the African American experience, and to a lesser degree to Native American. I hope I do not bore you too much with the ramblings of an old man who in just 39 days short, in just a short 39 days, I will have been around the sun 77 times. I need to make a disclaimer for what I'm about to say. These are my opinions and observations, and I take full responsibility for them. So please do not take anything that I say as an official position of LSP or any other organization that I may be affiliated with. Obviously, I recognize that some of what I am about to share may be difficult for some to hear. I hope you will stay with me until the end. Traditionally, most executive directors are expected to spend the bulk of their time fundraising. LSP was a new organization embarking on a mission like no other, perhaps with the single exception of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. LSP chose a mission that the bulk of the public would rather not engage in, rather not talk about, and an often heard comment or variations of that comment is, why open these old wounds? And with that, I accepted being the face of LSP to openly confront in a very public way discussions about lynchings and racial terrorism and its aftermath. I accepted being the face to talk about all of this racial terrorism. I have engaged in this work in Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, and Mississippi, and I have appeared on all the news media, print, radio, television, both locally and nationally. The more I did this work, the more I was driven to find out how some of this came about. Before I begin, I would like to share with you my experience as a very young child coming to consciousness about racism in a tangible way for the first time, and one that left an impression on me. From my time, even as a young child, I had a need, though not clearly defined, to understand this position that Black people had been placed in. In my early years, I lived on a farm deep in the country with my grandparents in the middle of Tennessee, in Middle Tennessee. It was, for all intents and purposes, an ideal life. And even though we did not have electricity or running water, my grandfather owned his own farm. Tobacco was the main crop. In the absence of the sharecropping experience for most Black farmers of that period, and as a result of our living in the deep woods, as a very young child, I had almost no contact with white people. The area of Wilson County that my grandfather and other African Americans were allowed to purchase land in was very much considered to be unsuitable for farming. In later life, I would come to realize that understand that condition would be my first lesson in understanding the determination, commitment, and work ethic of disfranchised people determined to make something out of what appeared to be nothing. This land that they were allowed to purchase was filled with sinkholes and interspersed with huge rocks and greatly overgrown. and as I said, highly unsuitable for farming. My grandfather, like most of the men and families in the community, had no mechanical equipment and relied totally on horses and mules for powering farm implements and as a means of transportation. One of the limiting factors to my little interaction with whites was the two, maybe three times a year that my grandparents went shopping in the town of Lebanon, Tennessee, which was via a wagon pulled by two horses. This was in the early 50s. We had no need for grocery shopping in the classical sense. Most purchases were for bulk staples and flour, sugar, salt, and an occasional pair of shoes for me. On rare occasions, they would purchase a 100-pound block of ice and just prior to heading home, wrap it in a multiple of blankets to minimize the melting. Upon arrival home, we placed the ice in an ice box, and for a few days we could enjoy the treat that ice would provide. Chief among those treats was Jell-O and homemade ice cream. A lot of the clothes that I wore were made by my grandmother, are purchased and sent to me by my father, who had permanently relocated to West Tennessee after my mother's death in 1943. I developed a love of reading very, very early in life and became an avid reader of the comic strips in the newspaper that my grandfather subscribed to. It was this love of reading coupled with our rare wagon trips to town that brought me to my first serious consciousness about racism, denial, and our assigned place in society. Adjacent to the store where my grandparents purchased most of their staples was a drugstore. This drugstore had a circular rack of comic books that I longed to read, and I longed to read those books. I could look through the window and see two or three little white boys about my age sitting on the floor reading the books to their heart's content. To this day, and I do not know how I knew, I don't ever remember anyone telling me that I couldn't, but somehow I just knew that I was not allowed to enter that store and read those books. That is just how pervasive and entrenched the system was. Black and white knew their places in this society without any real need for serious dialogue. The legacy and actual effect of racism now became real and an actual experience for me. It was no longer some lingering idea that all of us kids knew about. It wasn't theoretical anymore, and it hurt. The remembrance of it still does. My experience, knowledge, and awareness of this legacy has only grown as I have matured into my senior years. But always the question, why? I think I'm beginning to find answers to the question that have gnawed at me throughout my life. Where did this modern day idea of inequality come from, and why is it so deeply entrenched in this information intensive age and appears to be intractable? For the rest of this conversation, I want to bookend this conversation using a calendar date for everything that I am about to say, starting with a date in the 15th century, about 1452, and ending with a date estimated to be somewhere between 2042 and 2060. A question African Americans have been asking for eternity, and one that I am still hearing or seeing on social media almost daily, is why do they hate us? That question all too frequently is accompanied by a recitation of things done by African Americans for the country or for white people in general. This question and recitation comes in much greater torrents around the incidents of an Ahmaud Arbery, a George Floyd, a Philando Castile, or Eric Garner. Most of the conversations regarding the African American in this experience in this country began with 1619. But it is my opinion that to understand the othering, the hate, the idea that Africans are less than human, one needs to go back further than 1619. Bear with me while I start sharing. Um, as I started to say, most conversation about the Africans began in 1619. But I want to go back, but one needs to go back further than 1619. In fact, let's return to the 15th century, 1452, Pope Nicholas, head of the Catholic Church from 1447 until his death in 1455, issued a document called a papal bull. A series of edicts were issued by the Catholic Church between 1452 and 1493, known as the Doctrine of Discovery, or as it is sometimes called, the doctrine of Christian discovery. And I want to paraphrase what Professor Robert Rule of St. John Fisher College has written concerning the native people of this land. And he says, many of the injustices in the United States are connected to or emerge from racism supported by the doctrine of Christian discovery. It is time for reformers to become more aware of the document of Christian discovery and its legacy in the United States. Its foundation in the Christian supremacist ideas articulated in the document of Christian discovery and the intergenerational trauma created for indigenous peoples and their families. So then, what is the doctrine of discovery? Let me play a video clip. The person that you will eventually hear speaking is Mark Charles. Mark Charles is a Native American activist and minister and a graduate of the University of California. What is the doctrine of discovery? The doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493. It was essentially the church in Europe saying the nations of Europe, whatever land you find not ruled by those people are less than human and the land is yours for the taking. But the real challenge with the doctrine of discovery is the ways it has influenced the foundations of our country.
In the 1400s, we have the writings of the papal bulls saying things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively became known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by Christian rulers, those people are less than human, and the land's yours for the taking. This was literally the doctrine that allowed European nations to go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the African people. They weren't fully human.
For those of you who have seen it, you know that I had a cameo appearance in the documentary The Yard. And The Yard, as you may be aware, was about the placement by Dr. Tim Hughes about the truth about Nathan Bedford Forrest. One of my comments in that documentary was that I have stated and repeated several times in other presentations, in person and via radio and television, is that the solutions we attempt to our social problem, racism, othering, don't work because they are based on a history that has been distorted or more specifically purposely hidden. Clearly, the idea that African people were less than human had no agency. That idea, at a minimum, had a 116-year head start sanctioned by the church. So in 1719, in this country, when Africans show up, they begin a legal sojourn of enslavement and are seen and treated the same as livestock in the field. They are bred, sold, and work the same as livestock in the field. Legally, with church sanctioning or the church turning a blind eye for the next 246 years, producing one of the wealthiest nations on earth. Keep in mind, the Europeans have been here in this country with these ideas about their sovereignty and their superiority since 1492. So for over 360 years, the idea of one born to serve and another to be served has been around. In a 4-year war between 1861 and 1865, and between 640,000 to 700,000 are killed, literally contesting the ideas contained in the doctrine of discovery. One of the main overriding ideas of the doctrine of discovery, if not the single main idea, was profit or simply money. Consider that the Civil War is over. A 246-year economic engine has been dismantled. Fortunes propped up by the number of enslaved people owned is gone. An idea propped up for 346 years by the church and government that protect whites has been legally struck down, at least on paper. With the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, whites are now told that former enslaved people are citizens and have the same rights and privileges as everyone else. In less than 10 years, between 1861 and 1868, enslaved African bodies whose humanity was never recognized have gone from an average value, white enslavers, of $800 to being perceived as the reason for great loss of wealth, in addition to competition for the resources. Desperate attempts were made to maintain the ideas put forth by the church and the doctrine of discovery. Enter the age of racial terrorism, black codes, Jim Crowism, designed to send a clear message to African Americans about their place in society. Mob action, extrajudicial punishment, lynchings are relatively unchecked. Churches, for the most part, remain silent or are complicit. African Americans in groups or as individuals who do manage to get ahead are consistently attacked and destroyed under some guise of feigned legality. The more glaring cases, as in the 20th century, occurred during a period known as Red Summer. As I started to say, and one of the more glaring instances of wealth being destroyed was the Red Summer of 1919. And as this slide depicts, racial tensions across the U.S. were exacerbated by the discharge of millions of military personnel to their homes and domestic lives following the end of the war. Competition for opportunities in post-war America, combined with a radically changed social landscape, placed whites and blacks in conflict with one another, leading to tragic results. And it's also interesting to notice on the side here that Pershing did not want African Americans in his army in Europe. He did not want to fight with them, but the French were demanding support. And so when the African American division did arrive, the 93rd, it was given to the French army, and of course they did excel. And there again, you're looking at the summer of 1919, the Red Summer, and all those different riots that occurred. And again, I wish I had more time to go into that. Ida B. Wells surreptitiously slipped into Elaine, Arkansas, and documented the loss to sharecroppers that in today's dollars would run into the millions. Estimates of losses from the Tulsa massacre run into the multi-millions of dollars. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, writing in his report, The Negro, in 1965, The Negro Famine, The Case for National Action, wrote that the Negro American has survived at all is extraordinary. Unless the people might simply have died out, as indeed others have. And Moynihan goes on to say, being Americans, they will now expect that in the near future, equal opportunities for them as a group will produce roughly equal results as compared with other groups. This is not going to happen, nor will it happen for generations to come unless a new and special effort is made. And here's the part that he says that I really want to get to. There are two reasons. First, the racist virus in American bloodstream still afflicts us. Negroes will encounter serious personal prejudice for at least another generation. Second, 3 centuries of sometimes unimaginable mistreatment have taken their toll on the Negro people. The harsh fact is that as a group at the present time, in terms of ability to win out in the competition of American life, they are not equal to most of the groups with which they will be competing. And this is important to remember. Individually, he said, individually, Negro Americans reach the highest peak of achievement. But collectively, the spectrum of American ethnic and religious and regional groups, where some get plenty and some get none, the most difficult fact for white Americans is to understand that in these terms, the circumstances of the Negro American community in recent years has probably been getting worse, not better. Perhaps no other area of continuing legacy of ideas put forth long ago is more agonizing and concerning for African Americans as law enforcement. But while slave patrols over time evolved into police, early slave patrols and post-Civil War police departments operated without regard to without regard to the humanity of African Americans, and often without regard for the quality of African Americans and the rights afforded them under the law. Here is a slide. Here is a slide depicting fatal police encounters since 2015 through September 21st of this year, a few days ago, a total of 5,662. And if you look, this number, 1337 is the number of black killed, 2575 is the number of whites killed. This is the percentages of those deaths in each one. In each case, if you'll notice that for that 5-year period, while African Americans make up 12.2% of the population, or sometimes roughly 13%, they represent 23%, 23.6% of the killing. Conversely, white Americans make up 63% of the population with 45.4%. And then I did, just for calculation, I did tend to see stats were maybe a little bit better. But again, you can see the same types of patterns of police encounter. Where the black community has always found a way in spite of overwhelming odds, there is no ability to find a way when one is dead. The continuing disproportionality of black Americans killed at the hands of law enforcement continues unabated and appears to have no restriction. Let me share another slide. Here is a graphic display of deaths nationwide in 2019 as a result of police shootings. As you can see there's been 1,004 killed in 2019. Black people represented 24% of those, still being only 13% of the population. Am I sharing this? Am I sharing this to be an indictment against the police? Absolutely not. And really not even against those that we consider to be rogue cops or bad cops. The police, as they have always been, are a mere reflection of a larger society. Their behavior as an institution reflects what they perceive the society wants and will condone. It is in that context that I would like to share with you excerpts from an article titled Domination and the Murder of George Floyd, written by Stephen Newcomb, co-founder and co-director of the Indigenous Law Institute. And Stephen Cohen writes, Domination and the Murder of George Floyd, the dehumanizing language expressed in the papal document provides the means of understanding the heartless killing of an African American named George Floyd by Minneapolis, Minnesota police. How could language from a document that is nearly 600 years old provide any insight into the present day actions of policemen working for a major American city? The answer is quite simple. Dominating and dehumanizing language expressed by the Pope Nicholas V to King Alfonso of Portugal told Alfonso that he was authorized to use deadly force toward the inhabitants of the western coast of Africa. The white man disguised as a policeman operating under color of law, kneeling on the blood vessels and neck of a black man who was begging for his life and saying he was about to die, was behaving in the exact manner of the Portuguese slavers who officially listed their captured black victims as 44 pieces, not flesh and blood humans, but pieces, domination and dehumanization. Slavery in America was in keeping with language authorizing slavery in the Vatican document. And this was one of the parts about his comments that I really want, that I think is applicable to us today. The attitudes, the values, and beliefs of a society operate in the deepest recesses of the mental world and the subconscious mind of the people of that society. A habitual thought process that resulted in the death of George Floyd occurred at a level of the cognitive unconscious or collective subconscious mind of American society. This deep place is the most difficult to reach, address, and change. But until we do, the conceptual foundations of the system of domination called America will continue to result in the killing of people of color. Certainly, as uncomfortable as it may be, it can be argued that the church had a significant role in the dehumanization of the colored people of the world. Lest you despair, I am delighted to share with you that in the 21st century has been a renewed effort on the part of the religious community to repudiate very specifically the doctrine of discovery, as well as systemic racism. A lot of that initiative was done as a result was done as a result of a push within the indigenous Native American community. So there is hope. And I'm going to just do a very quick aside here since I have my good friend Tom, who is the chair of the LSP, and I'm going to pull up the Episcopal. Here is the Episcopal Church, and there's a number of churches as you see on this list here, but I just thought I'd share that one with you. And I've got some good friends on the line, and I probably have others that I just don't know what their denomination is. But I have a good friend on the line from Chicago who is Catholic. 13 Catholic groups in solidarity with the indigenous people joined their request and asked Pope Francis to rescind the papal bulls from the 15th century. So there is hope. All is not lost. You will recall at the beginning, I talked about bookending this conversation, and my bookend for the front side was somewhere between 2042 and 2060. There's not a lot that I can say about that, as it is a future date, and my comments are based on future events. Just as churches in the 21st century have started to embrace the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, as all of you are aware, white nationalism and white supremacy is still very much alive in this country. Witness the Charlottesville debacle and numerous other white supremacist movements in this country. A lot of their fears are born out of the demographer's report that somewhere between 2042 and 2060, white people will no longer be the majority population in this country. And that, coupled with a continuing belief in the ideas of a doctrine of discovery, will continue to drive serious racial discord and behavior. It has been my honor and pleasure for the last 3 years to be one of the more active faces of the Lynching Fights Project, and there are many fond remembrances that I would like to think, and I would like to think that I have made a small difference in some ways. Some of my most cherished moments are with young people, high school and especially college students, who I think truly appreciate someone acknowledging a past that they only hear about in whisper. It is a validation of their humanity and that they count. Although I am leaving LSP as the executive director, I want to call your attention to another very important organization that I am a part of. In fact, I am the president, but they may kick me out since I haven't done anything in the past 30 days or so. The Tennesseans for Historical Justice the Tennesseans for Historical Justice. On the front lines of most of her life, retired Representative Johnny Turner fought a 15-year battle to get the Tennessee legislature to pass the state-level equivalent of the Emmett Till Act. She was successful, and in 2017, that legislation was signed into law. A group of dedicated attorneys organized the Tennesseans for Historical Justice for the purpose of investigating cold cases and aggressively engaging in community activities. Please visit their website and support them as well. My sincere thanks to all of you for taking the time out of your day to listen to my rambling. I hope I haven't offended anyone. I hope I've said something that is in fact of value to everyone. And with that, I will turn it back to Tom and open it up for questions or comments.